Hi there, booktube. Welcome to the Reading Fabricator. I'm Russell, and today I'm going to do something a bit different. Instead of doing a book review, I'm actually going to talk about a short story. In particular, a short story from a book that I would say that I would read in 2022. And that is from the 10th of December by George Saunders, and the story is Escape from Spiderhead, which most would know as a new film that just came out starring Chris Hemsworth and Miles Teller. The story is roughly about 35 pages in length, so you could read it in under an hour if you wanted to. In fact, a lot of these stories in this book here are a decent length that can be read in a short period of time. Now, when it comes to George Saunders, I have a pretty mixed relationship with him. I first tried to read Lincoln in the Bardo back when that was released in, I think, 2018 or something like that. And I seem to be the only person on the planet who did not like that book. I mean, I thought it was fine writing and all, but I just did not connect with it as everyone else did. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of people out there who'll be very, very pissed at it about my response to it. But that's just how it is. Sometimes there's books that you read that you just don't respond to that everyone else does. Another one, for example, is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. I didn't respond to that book particularly well either. Now, the short story revolves around a character named Jeff and this mysterious being, this mysterious person, this personality who hides behind a one-man mirror. And he goes by the name of Amnesty. And the whole story is about Jeff, who was put away for a crime, but his mother paid an absolute fortune to have him taken from prison and put into this detention center that coexists as more of a pharmaceuticals trials, just a trialing center sort of thing, where you still serve your time, but you're volunteering for trials, and in return you're sort of given a more privileged lifestyle compared to being in prison. It's all about taking experimental drugs that are created by this Amnesty figurehead and his assistant. His assistant by the name of Verlaine, who during the course of the night will go to each of these, I guess you can call them prisoners' rooms, and take their Moby packs. So with their Moby packs are these devices that are worn on the person, and inside them you put these little capsules or these drugs, and each one is a different type of drug, and through that you can remotely administer it into the body, and it will cause them to have a different response. Usually it's sort of like a thought-controlling drug and a feeling-controlling drug. It makes you think differently and feel differently. The book basically revolves around the whole idea of free will, the will to live, the will to do as you please. And I thought that was quite interesting. This short story deals with some pretty heady themes, some heavy ideas, and it provides them and provokes you into thinking about them in quite idealistic ways. It's very well written, a good book. The only other thing I've read by him would have to be The Brief Frightening Reign of Phil, which I thought had the writing itself was static, but the themes are amazing. I think that's what George Saunders is remembered for, is how he provides these ideas and sort of turns them on their head a little bit. He's quite good at doing that. So at the start of the short story, we have the character Jeff, the prisoner. We have Amnesty, the whole guy behind the operation, and his assistant Verlaine, and they're in this garden. They're outside the facility. And he begins to administer this drug called Verbaluse onto Jeff. And at first, Jeff sees the garden as just being just normal, just boring. But as the Verbaluse gets administered into his body, he begins to see it in a much more beautiful context. And I'm going to read to you that context. It's in the second page of the book. I think it's very well written, so I'm going to give it a good read now. So in my edition of the book, it's on page 46. Right? He added some Verbaluse to the drip, and soon I was feeling the same things, but saying them better. The garden still looked nice. It was like the bushes were so tight seeming, and the sun made everything stand out. It was like any moment you expected some Victorians to wander in with their cups of tea. It was as if the garden had become a sort of embodiment of the domestic dreams forever intrinsic to human consciousness. It was as if I could suddenly discern in this contemporary vignette the ancient corollary through which Plato and some contemporaries might have strolled. To wit, I was sensing the eternal in the ephemeral. I sat pleasantly engaged in these thoughts until the Verbaluse began to wane, at which point the garden just looked nice again. It was something about the bushes and whatnot. It made you just want to lay out there and catch rays and think your happy thoughts, if you get what I mean. Then whatever else was in the drip wore off, and I didn't feel much about the garden one way or the other. My mouth was dry, though, and my gut had that post-Verbaluse feel to it. So as you can see from that passage I just read, when these drugs kick into your body, they just make you think differently. They make you feel differently. And I think that's what Amnesty is trying to do, is trying to create these different drugs that sort of control you a little bit. So after that opening section, Jeff moves back inside the facility into what is referred to as one of the workrooms in one of the what is referred to as one of the spider legs. Now, the reason for Spiderhead is because Abnesti does all this from a control room. And this control room has 6 different legs, which are all work rooms, almost like 6 legs of a spider, hence the term Spiderhead. I really like how it's all described. There's a sci-fi aspect to it, but it could also take place in the modern time. And there's an almost satirist feel to it. George Saunders is also always commented on as being basically a modern day Mark Twain and an absolute prose stylist of his type, like of his caliber. He's held in high regard by people like Zadie Smith and Jonathan Franzen and Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace. So he's got a lot of high acclaim, and this is probably the best thing I've read by him out of the 3 by a long margin. I mean, I think the brief frightening reign of Phil was fine, and I didn't really care for Lincoln in the Butter that much. But this is my first attempt at his short stories, and people say that his short stories are where he's at, where he's in his own echelon when it comes to that sort of thing. And I agree with them. I think it's absolutely wonderful. I think this is a great introduction into his work. For those of you who are watching the film, you're probably better off reading the short story, because I watched the film earlier today, and although it does contain the themes, it expands upon it, but I think it expands upon it in all the wrong ways, and I didn't like the ending at all. The ending to this short story, although I will not spoil it, it has a more darker, more sinister, but also technically a more humane way of going about things. And it's not what I expected when I expect Escape from Spiderhead. I was expecting, like something like The Great Escape, but he does escape it in a different sort of way. I'm just gonna leave it at that. So let your mind do the thinking. But I'd say give this book a read. Getting back to the story, after he has that whole thing going on in the garden, he goes into one of the workrooms, and there he's joined by a mysterious blonde woman by the name of Heather. At first, Abnesti tries to get them to talk about each other, how they view each other in terms of attractiveness, and they're both, they think the other person's fine, nothing great to look at, but then he administers another drug into both their bodies, remotely of course, through their Moby packs. And this causes them to have these complete, overwhelming attentiveness to one another. They get out, they start making out, and then eventually they start having sex right there in front of Abnesti and his assistant, and they don't do it once, they do it 3 times. And it's absolutely, I think sinister is the right word to go by. The whole idea of it is just frightening. It's told in sort of a humorous aspect, but there's definitely a lot of frightening themes going on here. Then, on the same day, he goes into a different room, and this time he's encountered by a dark-haired girl. Same thing. They get asked the same questions, they get administered the drug, and then the same thing happens again. They engage in sex 3 times. Then this is where it gets very interesting. He goes into another room, and this time he's encountered by a tattooed man by the name of Rogan. But instead, they just sit there and they stare at each other. And then after a while, Abnesti, through the PA, through the one-way mirror, he can look at them, but they can't look at him. He says, "Okay, that's it, you can go now." And Jeff doesn't know what to make about this. So he goes outside and goes up to the control room, into the Spiderhead, so to speak, and he sees Heather sitting there. What we come to learn is that there's a drug by the name of Darken Flocks, which has been described as, I've got it written down here, imagine the worst you have ever felt times 10. That doesn't even come close to how you feel when on Darken Flocks. So basically it's the sort of drug where if administered too much, could lead to you committing suicide. It could lead to you hallucinating, thinking about the worst things imaginable. I don't know, the first thing that came to my mind was like Bird Box, where you just see something truly horrific and it leads you to do horrible things. What the study is about the idea of love, whether because Heather had sex with both Rogan and Jeff, it turns out, both of them 3 times I believe, she had to choose which one to administer the Darken Flocks to. And whichever one she chose, it means that she cared more for the other, but she decided not to give either of them Darken Flocks. Then Jeff gets called into the room, and this time Heather and the dark-haired girl, I can't remember her name, I think her name was Rachel or something like that, they're sitting next to each other, and he has to choose which one of them to give Darken Flocks to, if any. Again, he rejects. So we got these things going on here, and it leads to a pretty, I'd say divisive, but still a very interesting conclusion. I'm not going to spoil it, but that's what you're getting at when you read the short story. And again, it is a short story. It's like 35 pages, so it can be done in one sitting. I read it in a couple of sittings, but it's really not what I expected at all. So there's all these ideas going on in there, strong ideas, and I related to it quite heavily. I think it's quite an interesting piece of sci-fi. piece of speculative sci-fi, and you could call it even realist sci-fi. This is the sort of thing that can happen. So, you've got pharmaceutical trials, but obviously this stuff is, like way into the future. But yeah, who knows? Who knows what happens? One thing I forgot to mention was that while they're engaged in sex, they also administer this other drug, which increases their vocabulary in a very pronounced way. They almost start waxing poetic while they're having sex or while they're describing each other. It's really quite interesting to see. One of the more shocking moments was when he is basically forced to administer Darkenflox to one of the girls, this time just one person sitting in there. And while she's administered with the Darkenflox, he is administered with the drug that pretty much increases your vocabulary and sees things as beautiful. So while she is freaking the fuck out, and something bad ends up happening, and she gets worse and worse as this is happening in the room right there in front of him, all in the space of about 5 minutes. He's just sitting there almost dumbfounded, almost in his own state of mind, just looking at it and just saying beautiful things about the whole thing, saying what's happening, saying increased words in a sentence. And that to me is probably the best part of the book, the peak of the story, sorry. So if this sounds like your thing, then by all means give it a read. I was quite surprised by how good it was. Unfortunately, I've seen the movie and I don't think it lives up to the potential of the book. I think it goes by things in a way too humorous aspect. I think there's nothing really sinister going on, at least after the first half of the movie. The short story, on the other hand, you're always on edge. You're always left in a sort of a frightening state, even though there are satirist aspects to it. But nonetheless, it is a good read. Highly recommended. The next short story I'm going to read is Drive My Car by Haruki Murakami. I have not read anything by him in at least 4 years, but in doing so, I can then go and watch the Drive My Car movie that came out last year, the highly acclaimed one, and I'm really looking forward to that. So yeah, all the best, and thanks very much. See you.